Marla, last Friday you published a report on the EU blacklist that came out earlier this year, and you also took a look at the previous EU blacklist that had come out. Could you just start off by commenting a little bit about what those blacklists are and what blacklisting in general entails?
Yes. So basically, the EU has decided that they will impose globally, not just within the EU, they will impose globally their own standards with respect to how they think taxes should be set and administered and applied all over the world, right? Now, the question I have around that is that how come the EU can decide that they have this authority to do this when really the OECD in the first place is the globally recognized authority on tax policy matters. Anyway, let's just forget that for now. The fact that the world recognizes the OECD as the authority, but anyway, the EU decides that they want to apply standards with respect to taxation policy across the world. And so what they do is they use the OECD's methodology and assessment of countries' tax policies, but they also apply additional requirements on various countries. And one of those requirements, quite curiously, is countries are not supposed to act outside of the EU's code of conduct. And you know, basically the EU is imposing its own code of conduct as well as other requirements on countries that are not EU members, which is rather strange on the face of it in the first place. And so what my article sought to do was to first publish what the OECD has published with respect to their assessment of the countries around their taxation policies and meeting the requirements. And some countries are listed as compliant, some are listed as largely compliant, all the way down to non-compliant. The only country that's listed by the OECD in the whole world as non-compliant is Trinidad and Tobago. Now, blacklisted jurisdictions, according to the EU, fall into the various categories of the OECD. The EU blacklist encompasses some countries that are largely compliant with the OECD, some countries that are provisionally largely compliant, and all the way down to Trinidad in the non-compliant category. And just one other thing I think it's important to note. The OECD itself does not blacklist any country. It's got a listing of, as I just mentioned, various ratings that range from compliant through largely compliant all the way down to non-compliant. So at no point is there a list from the OECD since 2009 that labels any country as being blacklisted. Only the EU assigns that kind of term to any country.
It sounds to me that the lower tax rate might have to do with lower levels of fiscal spending, and I know that you took a look at that in your paper. Could you just tell us a little bit about that?
Yes, and so one of the reasons I think the EU is worried about its attractiveness as a place to do business is the fact that the EU has a corporate tax rate on average that's higher than the global average. And so I think that this is could be a competitiveness issue, right? They think that they're being outcompeted by countries with low tax rates. Though within the EU, there are countries that do have low tax rates, like Hungary and Ireland, for example. But in any event, the EU overall has a higher tax rate than the average for the world. And so that says a few things. It says that, well, it makes one wonder, well, why is the EU tax rate so high? And in digging deeper, I realized that first of all, the EU carries a very high level of debt. And they're actually carrying a higher level of debt to GDP than the blacklisted countries. And why is the EU carrying this very high level of debt as a group? Well, the EU actually, the countries on average have higher levels of fiscal spending as a percentage of total GDP, and therefore a higher level of fiscal revenue that has to be earned to support this level of fiscal spending. Now, why would the EU have this a very high level of fiscal expenditure relative to the global average and certainly the average for the blacklisted countries? Well, the EU has, it would appear, European countries have adopted a certain ideology as it relates to the way that they spend on social social programs and provision of public services and benefits. And that's all well and good, and they're well within their right to decide that this is the ideology that they want to adopt. But what it appears to me is that they are now trying to impose this ideology on other countries by insisting that that countries outside of the EU ought not to have low tax rates and ought not to allow countries from outside of their jurisdiction to register in their jurisdiction and benefit from lower tax rates, which of course, by the way, with the base erosion and profit shifting initiative, that can no longer take place. But that apparently did not satisfy the EU. They want to go further and try to force countries outside of the EU to apply tax rates that are higher than they currently do, so that their own competitiveness as a jurisdiction to do business in is not as badly affected. From my perspective, that's what they're most worried about.
Let's talk about the other commonality that we found between the countries that are blacklisted, and there are some countries that had the similar profile with OECD that were not included in the blacklist. So it seems that there's some sort of pattern going on, and if you could just tell us a little bit about what you found and what that other commonality is.
So if you look at the list itself, the 2017 blacklist of 17 countries and the 2019 blacklist of 15 countries, when the list first came out, I looked at the names of all of these countries and I said, this doesn't seem quite right to me. All of these countries, I felt, seemed to be all predominantly non-white. And so I went and looked in the data, and it was actually confirmed that you have countries that are predominantly Black, predominantly Hispanic and or mixed or indigenous, like Samoan, for example, or Arab. And so that I found was quite strange. Like, how is it possible that in both your blacklist, not one single country listed there was a predominantly white country? And then I went in further into the data to look at the countries that are predominantly white, but have a similar OECD listing or have a similar tax structure. And now, if you look at countries like, for example, Bermuda, which is an overseas territory of the UK, it was blacklisted, but you also have the other UK territories that are like Gibraltar, for example, that have a similar tax structure to Bermuda, similar rating by the OECD, but Gibraltar is not blacklisted. Also, you have US territories. Now, the US is listed as largely compliant by the OECD. And some of the US's territories, like American Samoa and US Virgin Islands, which of course are predominantly non-white, they are listed on the blacklist. But the US's states of Delaware and Nevada are not listed on the blacklist. And they are also low tax jurisdictions. And so you see a double standard, basically, in the application of the EU's rule or assessment of who should be on the blacklist, meaning territories that are not fully compliant with the OECD and who are not in compliance completely with the OECD, but also have low taxes and other tax structures that the EU isn't happy with. So there is clearly a double standard in the application of the tax of the blacklist, and the tax standards that the EU has rolled out. I think one of the reasons for that, by the way, is, as I found in the data, the proportion of the EU population that is non-white is 10%, so minority. But if you look at the EU institutions themselves, the proportion of the staff at the EU institutions that are non-white are 1%. It's 1%. And so that means that, not only are non-white a minority in the EU, they're even smaller minority in the EU institutions. And so therefore, I think the views of the minorities in the EU are not well represented in the decision-making process of the EU. And that is a possible explanation as to why we've seen the kind of double standard being applied. So the link to the report is bit.ly/Blacklist 2019, all in lowercase. And in that report, you will see the whole explanation of the OECD's assessment and the EU. You will also see a link to the CARICOM's response to the EU blacklisting, which I thought was a really, really good response. And I found in CARICOM's response, I found it very, very heartbreaking to learn that the EU first reached out to Dominica to ask Dominica to comply with the EU's standards only 6 months after Dominica lost 224% of GDP in hurricane damages in late 2017. 6 months later, the EU says to Dominica, you need to comply with our tax standards. I found that was just utterly disrespectful and inexcusable. And I hope people read the report and appreciate the explanations in there and understand better what this EU blacklist really means to us in the Caribbean, and that you can reach out to your leaders to try to get them to do something about it as a region.
Any other final takeaways?
Well, I think that the final takeaway here is that maybe, I mean, all of the feedback I've gotten so far is a lot of people saying, are you surprised? Are you surprised? And the thing is, while I'm not completely surprised, to admit that we're not surprised means that we kind of expected this. And to say that we expected this means that we should have known it was going to come, and then what are we doing about it? So it says to me, we're not doing enough. And so that's my final takeaway. What are we doing about this? We need to address this.